Hello, everybody. Welcome to this virtual space. I am appreciative for everybody that is taking the time to watch this training. My name is Felicia Gallegos. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Outreach and Prevention Coordinator for the Sexual Assault and Anti-Violence Information Office, otherwise known as the SAVI office here at Utah State.
And I am Tanisha. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Employee Focused Prevention Specialist in the Office of Equity here at Utah State.
So I want to briefly discuss what we'll be covering in this training, and then we'll introduce our offices and get well on the way. So like I said, we will be starting with introductions of our office in case you've forgotten or need a little reminder of what we do. Then we will be talking about victim blaming, what it is and why we do it. Then we'll lead into a conversation on upstanding. How do we shift our culture away from victim blaming? And we'll end with discussing some scenarios of how we can implement the upstanding behaviors we talk about. So as I mentioned, am from the SAVI office. We are a resource on campus that provides confidential advocacy and therapy to students, faculty, staff, their dependents, and their partners of USU. So anybody across our statewide system who knows somebody who's experienced or has witnessed any form of violence can seek services within our office. We provide both survivor advocacy and trauma-focused therapy. So the core purpose of our office really is to provide a supportive space for healing. And then we also collaborate with the Office of Equity and other areas on campus to provide outreach and education. At the end of the day, we would love Utah State University to be a space where violence does not happen. And so a lot of outreach and education goes into helping inform our community about expectations we have of behavior and also just how we can support survivors and the resources that are available to them. And I will turn this time to Tanisha to talk about the Office of Equity.
So our Office of Equity at Utah State is the neutral office on campus. While SAVI, like Felicia just talked about, is really survivor focused and survivor centered, the Office of Equity is a neutral space to help with reports of sexual misconduct. So we offer supportive measures. So if someone needs accommodation because they've experienced something like sexual misconduct or discrimination, whether that's at work or school, our Office of Equity offers those. We also have an administrative reporting process. So if someone experiences sexual misconduct or discrimination, they can report it to our Office of Equity. And that's where our neutrality comes in, where we neutrally investigate the incident and respond appropriately. And then we also work with SAVI and other entities across campus to provide prevention and education. And we have the same goal as SAVI of ideally no sexual misconduct or discrimination or violence of any kind happening at our university. So we're going to start by talking about what victim blaming is. Basically defined, victim blaming are statements or questions that imply a victim is somewhat responsible for the violence they experience. So instead of putting the blame and the responsibility on the perpetrator or the person who engaged in the violence, we're putting it on the victim by saying things like, oh, they shouldn't have been drinking, which implies that if they weren't drinking, it wouldn't have happened, or questioning, why were you wearing that? Or you shouldn't have been a flirt. Why didn't you tell someone? I would have fought back. So suggesting that what they did wasn't the right thing to do. Did you tell them no? So victim blaming are statements that are really questioning what a victim does before, during, or after violence occurs. And it's really harmful. And in fact, even in investigations, especially like in our office, for example, where questions are asked, these victim blaming questions are never asked because they're not important, right? It's not important what someone's decisions and behaviors are, right? Before, during, or after. It's more about what happened. So I want to talk about why we victim blame. And essentially what it comes down to is self-protection. It's our brain's defensive mechanisms. First and foremost, many well-intentioned individuals victim blame in an effort to protect themselves. So victim blaming is not done maliciously. Usually it's done because we're trying to say, hey, if someone did something that was their fault, that means if I don't do that thing, or if I do something differently, I can protect myself from ever experiencing violence or having the same thing happening to me. And I think that's really important to remember, because that's the first step to addressing victim blaming, is recognizing that the intent behind it isn't ill-intentioned, right? It's meant to protect ourselves, even though it can be really harmful. It's just this defense mechanism we have. And we also have this just world bias, most of us, of if people who do good will have good things happen to them, and people who do bad will have bad things happen to them. And that's not true. And in fact, we know that because we say life isn't fair, right? Good things happen to bad people, and bad things happen to good people, right? So remembering that before we say something or ask a question can be really key to moving past and not saying something victim blaming. And then this other part, this is a quote from Deborah Turkheimer, who wrote the book Credible, which I still have on my reading list. I know Felicia highly recommends it. This quote says, "The reality is we don't want to believe violence is as prevalent as it is." And there's a couple of reasons for this. We don't want to believe violence is as prevalent as it is because that means it could happen to us, to people we love. That means that people we love or know are doing these things, are engaging in violence. That also means that if we say this is happening and it's prevalent, that now we have to do something about it, which can be really hard and scary to come to terms with. But it is happening and it is prevalent, unfortunately, even here at our Utah State community. And another reason why we don't want to believe it's as prevalent as it is because what happens when reports are made, which I want to show you all some statistics related to that. These statistics are from RAIN, the National Sexual Assault Hotline, and they did some number crunching and found that out of every 1,000 sexual assaults, only a third of those are even reported to police. Of those that are reported, only 50 lead to arrest. 28 of those actually end in some sort of felony conviction, and of those, even not all of them are incarcerated. So out of every 1,000 sexual assaults, 975 perpetrators of violence walk free. And so this isn't saying that reporting or not reporting is the right or wrong thing to do. This is illustrating that a couple of points. So first, we see these numbers and we hear all of these sexual assaults and sexual misconduct is happening. And then we see that there are no consequences for 975 of the people. And so our brains make this connection that means these 975 people must not have done it or must not be guilty, which isn't true, right? Again, most aren't even reported, but that doesn't mean they didn't happen. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So that creates this narrative in society that, okay, consequences aren't happening, so that means they didn't do it or someone was lying. And then it's a vicious cycle because then survivors are even less likely to report, right? Because then they see out there that, oh, if I report, nothing's gonna happen. Or if I report, people aren't going to believe me, which is part of this victim blaming attitude. And at USU, approximately a third never tell anyone about their assault. That's an incredibly high number. So not only are they not reporting it to police or Title IX, which again is okay that they're not doing that, they're also not telling friends or family. So this isn't just thinking about the context of your job at the university. This is also thinking about your context as a human being. People aren't even reaching out for support and resources, even if that's what they want. And because we have this narrative that people are lying because not a lot of people face consequences for their actions, we've come to this idea that false reports are the norm, and that is not true. We don't want to accept how common sexual assault is, and we see these numbers of consequences that we just showed, and then we start overestimating the percentages of sexual assault reports that are false. So instead of defaulting to this person is telling the truth, we start defaulting to this must be a lie. In fact, research shows that only about 2 to 8% of sexual assault reports are false. That's an incredibly small number. So we should be defaulting to that person's telling the truth, right? Because that's what the research shows. And these false reports aren't at any higher percentage than any other crime. So sexual assault is not falsely reported more than other crimes. And I also want to highlight here that just because, even if we think someone's false reporting, first of all, oftentimes that's not even our job to worry about, right? We're not putting consequences on someone. And even if we are in a position as an investigator or something like that, of these incidences, that person is probably struggling with something else, right? There's probably something else that's going on that they need help with, right? Again, it's not necessarily coming from a malicious place. They're struggling, and that's important to know. But again, the default is they're telling the truth. So that start by believing that we talk about at our university. And something that can help clarify this is talking about the difference between like a false report, someone recanting, and then an unfounded report, because we don't usually distinguish between these three. And I think that's where we get these ideas clumped together. So let's talk about it. A false report is a report that did not happen, and through an investigation, it was determined to be false. So 2 to 8% of them are false reports, and we've proved that someone was lying or not telling the truth for whatever reason. Where the other big thing is someone recanting. So this is when the survivor retracts or withdraws the report. And this does not mean the report is false. Survivors retract or withdraw their statements for a lot of different reasons. Maybe it's because of pressure from family or friends. Maybe it's pressure from people in the system, right? Maybe it's pressure from the person who engaged in the violence themselves. Maybe they change their mind and they're like, you know what, this is too difficult to go through. Or, you know what, I don't want anyone to get in trouble. So there's a lot of valid reasons why someone recants, and that does not mean the report is false. The other is an unfounded report. This is when there's not enough or any evidence present that supports that a crime or policy violation happened. Again, this doesn't mean the report is false. Especially with sexual misconduct, evidence can be trickier to come by, right? And sometimes this can happen in 2 different ways. So maybe something that happened wasn't okay, but it doesn't rise to the level of being criminal or a policy violation. That doesn't mean the thing didn't happen. That just doesn't mean that it reaches that criminal or policy level. Or it does reach that level, but there's just not the evidence there to support it, which can happen. And again, that doesn't mean someone's lying. That just means there's not evidence there. So this is really important to distinguish that, again, most reports are true. And if someone doesn't report, or if they recant their report, or if a perpetrator isn't convicted, that doesn't mean something didn't happen. That just means maybe someone recanted or the report was unfounded. So I think our next one is a video that Felicia is going to intro to, but that shows how and when, and a good example of a survivor potentially recanting, right? And what led that to happen. So Felicia, I'll let you introduce that.
Yeah, so for those of you who have not, thank you, Tanisha. For those of you who have not, Unbelievable is a short series on Netflix that talks about, or that shows a true story about an individual who came forward and reported a sexual assault and wasn't believed. But as time went on and a new detective took over the case after realizing a pattern in reports, this new detective engaged in a very trauma-informed interview process. And ultimately, they were able to realize that this individual who you see on your screen now, Marie, that she was telling the truth about her assault. And then they were able to bring a perpetrator to justice. But I encourage you all to watch the series on Netflix and see how it all unfolds. But this particular clip, as Tanisha mentioned, is just to highlight for you all who may not have experience talking to survivors about their experience, about why somebody would recant. A lot of times because of kind of this just world mentality that we have, we often think, if I was a survivor and I experienced violence, I would report it and I would make sure that I stayed involved in the process until somebody was held accountable, right? I would go through the entire court process and make sure that that justice happened. And so we think that that is kind of the norm, when in reality, there are so many reasons why somebody would not report their experience, right? And so we want to show this clip to help you see a little bit into an experience that a survivor could potentially have that would lead them to recanting their story or choosing to no longer seek justice or action on their perpetrator. So that is a heavy clip, and I encourage you, if you need to pause for a minute and breathe. But I'm going to continue on, breaking down that clip. A few things to note. First of all, I want to make it very clear that not every reporting experience a survivor has is like that. There are so many detectives who are trauma informed and understand how to support a survivor in reporting. And again, I encourage you all to watch this series because you do see that unfold later on in later episodes. So I know that is not every survivor's experience, but it's also not a rare experience for a survivor to go through what Marie went through, right? To be questioned and doubted, and not only when they're formally reporting, but also when they come forward to friends and family members, right? The reaction of those detectives, the questions they had, I truly don't believe that those detectives were trying to be malicious in any way, right? They were trying to be understanding, they were trying to be supportive, but they were also trying to make it make sense. They were trying to create a narrative that was ultimately believable, because what had truly happened, they had problems with. It challenged their narrative. There were inconsistencies, and that caused them to kind of blame and question Marie, the victim, right? But as I mentioned, she was telling the truth. And if we would have come to that conversation with a start by believing mentality of what happened to you, I believe happened to you, and worked from that, there would have been a different experience that she had. But again, going back to, it's more likely than not that we're going to resort to that victim blaming, that we're going to resort to that questioning of the individual who experienced, like, what did you do? Are you sure this happened? Stories aren't matching up. You have a history of kind of not telling the truth, right? All these different things can play into us beginning to question a survivor rather than believing them. And ultimately, I mean, think about yourself. If you came forward with an experience you had and you were being judged and questioned about it, you're likely not going to tell anybody that story anymore, whether that's to a formal authority to report that or to friends and family members. You're just going to keep it to yourself because it's too difficult to come forward and tell your story and not be believed, right? So this leads me into our next reason for victim blaming, and I want to talk about that I want to talk about, and that's the fact that instances of sexual misconduct often violate our beliefs of what a survivor looks like, what a perpetrator looks like, and what abuse looks like, right? We've been fed this narrative, whether that's through our the media we're consuming, like the TV shows and the movies we're watching, or if it's through conversations with our families and friends. We've constructed this idea of what sexual misconduct should look like. And then when a survivor comes forward and tells their experience, if it doesn't fit our box, our narrative, we're going to question it, right? Because it's not matching up. It's not making sense to us. When in the reality, the majority of time when somebody has an experiences sexual misconduct, it's not going to fit within that box that we've been told, right? It's not going to fit the narrative because so many experiences, pretty much every experience is so individualized and looks different for everybody. So I want to get into this a little bit, and I want you to start and be honest with yourself as we go through this next section about the narrative you've constructed for yourself around sexual misconduct. And I want you to begin trying to break that down because it truly will help you overcome any victim blaming mental or tendencies that you might have or that we all have. So the first thing I want to do is look at the survivor. If I were to ask you what a typical survivor looked like, you would likely give me two narratives. The first is going to be somebody who is a woman, a white woman most likely, who is promiscuous, who dresses very provocatively, is sexually promiscuous, a big flirt, and maybe consumes a lot of drugs and alcohol. She does a lot of things that kind of put her in a situation to be sexually assaulted. That is one narrative of survivor, right? And when that person comes forward, the response they often get is, well, you were asking for it. Look at the way that you dressed. Look at the way you were acting. You were leading that person on. Of course this happened, right? And completely blamed for what they've experienced, even though it doesn't matter what somebody wears, how much they consume, how much they flirt, or where they're at. None of that matters. When it comes down to sexual violence, the perpetrator is the sole person responsible for causing harm to another person, right? The other narrative of a survivor that you might tell me is somebody who is also a white woman, conservative, very calm, proper, keeps to herself, wasn't asking for it in any type of way, and was violently assaulted, right? Whether that, and most likely from a stranger, a stranger took advantage of this individual. Now, this narrative is what we call the perfect victim narrative. This idea where someone was doing nothing, saying nothing, wasn't wearing anything that was essentially saying that they're asking for it, right? They were doing everything opposite of that. Even though I want to clarify, nobody is ever asking to be sexually assaulted. You literally can't do that. But they aren't asking for it in any way, and somebody takes advantage of them. When a survivor comes forward and reports that experience, they're likely to be believed because it fits the narrative you've been told, right? It fits what you've been shown in movies and TV shows, and so you're more likely to believe them. And our laws and policies can oftentimes be written for that narrative, right? And so it can be hard to gather evidence when that's not the story that's happening. But the reality is, anyone can experience sexual violence. Anyone, any gender, race, socioeconomic status, anyone, no matter what they were doing or saying, anyone can experience sexual violence. That is way more difficult and heavy to sit with than believing that there's this perfect victim narrative, right? That there's this certain person who experiences sexual violence. When you have to think about, honestly, anybody can experience sexual violence, that's overwhelming and scary. It feels uncontrollable and like we can't protect ourselves. But that is the reality. And so believing that, and when you believe that anyone can experience abuse, you're more likely to recognize, and when someone comes forward, that they are telling the truth, right? And to believe them. So I want you to start by challenging your idea of what a survivor looks like. And any idea you have in mind, just get rid of it, because anyone can be a survivor. The next thing I want to talk about is just a little bit about the survivor experience to help you understand why survivors respond the way they do when they experience violence. Because we've also been told a part of the perfect victim narrative is that somebody who experiences sexual violence responds a certain way. So in the short term, they should be hysterical. They should be upset. Not too upset though, because if they're too upset, then they're probably faking it, is a message that I hear a lot, even though that's not the case. But we believe that they should be upset, that they should immediately want to report that they should immediately want to get medical care. That's kind of what we think should happen after someone experiences sexual violence. When in reality, the way a survivor responds just is all over the place. There are so many different responses that somebody can have. Sometimes we see humor, right? Survivors joking about what happened to them as a way to cope and understand, cope with what they went through. While every survivor can be different, there is something that commonly occurs when somebody experiences violence, and it's called tonic immobility. This is essentially a freeze response. Now, we're taught fight or flight quite frequently, that when a trauma is happening to you, your body goes into this fight or flight response where you either fight to get out of the situation or flee and get away from the situation, right? Majority of the time when somebody experiences sexual misconduct, they're going to enter this tonic immobility, this freeze state, where they're still present physically and they can still talk and move, but internally they're having a blackout. Their body is freezing. And again, it's another protective mechanism. It's their body protecting itself from what's happening. But what this does is that following the trauma, the survivor is very confused about what happened, because it's almost like a black spot in their memory, right? And not only, I like to talk about it as, if you were to take your story, if a survivor was to take their story and to write it down on a piece of paper, and then you take sticky notes for each word. So you look at their story and you take a word and you put it on a sticky note, one word per sticky note, and you put them all up around a room, all over the walls in a random room, and you invite people in and you say, okay, here's all these sticky notes, put the story together, make it make sense. That's what it's like for a survivor. And when a survivor experiences tonic immobility, it's like if you put all those sticky notes up and then you put a black curtain over the sticky notes, right? And so you can't even see where to begin. And then even when you do see the sticky notes, it's still so muddled and mixed and confusing. And for individuals, that black curtain, as they heal, can start to fade away. As time goes on, that curtain can start to give way to more of the story, more of what happened to them. But it's not like a consistent, like in 5 days you'll understand that curtain will be removed. Like it's not a consistent experience. It's different for everyone. So for some people, it can take years, decades to really remove that black curtain and start to make sense of those sticky notes story, right? So that's what someone is experiencing when they experience sexual misconduct. So not only are they thinking, oh my goodness, what just happened to me? Then they have to think about, how do I feel about what happened to me, right? Like, I have to say that I experienced sexual assault. Like, I'm one of those people. And then they have to say, what do I want to do about it, right? Those are not simple questions by any means. And during that whole time, they have immense guilt and shame topped onto that experience of tonic immobility, right? Because of this victim blaming society that we live in, where when someone comes forward, they're more likely to be questioned and doubted, survivors are automatically doing the same thing to themselves, right? They're asking themselves, why did I go there? Why didn't I fight back? Why did I dress that way? What they are asking themselves these questions because they've been conditioned to ask these questions. When in reality, they are not responsible at all for what happened to them. But we don't live in a society that has accepted that fully yet. And so that immense guilt and shame comes on top of trying to understand their experience, and they're more likely to blame themselves than even blame their perpetrator, which then leads them to be more likely to not report than to report, because they're already feeling somewhat responsible for what happened to them. And why would you go forward and report that, right? I might get myself in trouble. Or more likely, they most likely care about who perpetrated their violence, right? And so they don't want them to get in trouble. And reporting is just an intense system. No matter how trauma informed you are and in investigating, or how patient the experience, we try to make the experience of reporting, it is an intense process. And so if you're not in a space to report that, you're not likely going to choose that, right? So helping understand the survivor experience, and again, I put this with the huge caveat that every experience is unique to each individual, but this is generally what someone's going through. And if we can understand this, when someone comes forward to us, rather than responding with doubt and blame, we're going to respond with empathy and understanding and patience, right? So that's a little bit about our survivor. Again, just challenging what you thought a survivor looks like and how they should respond. The next I want to talk about is a perpetrator. Now, we always, in our society, we think of perpetrators as the bad guy, right? This horrible monster who has no heart, is likely male, and they are aggressive and they purposefully are hurting somebody, right? They are jumping out of a bush, they are drugging somebody to take advantage of them, they are purposely causing harm to somebody else. And coupled with this is the idea that a good person would never cause harm, right? A good person would never abuse. It's only these bad guys. When in reality, just like a survivor can be anybody, so can a perpetrator. Anyone can cause harm to another individual, especially given the fact that we live in a society that often fails to correctly teach boundaries and respect and communication, right? We don't have these foundational classes about this is how to set your own boundaries, this is how to communicate them, this is how to practice consent in a respectful way. We don't have these foundational classes. And all we really have to learn from is media and our personal experiences, right? What we've seen in with our friends and family members, or what we've seen in our movies and TV shows. And I hate to break it to you, but especially with media, the majority of situations we see happening, of relationships happening through media, are not the healthiest, right? They don't practice consent in movies and TV shows. They just do. And so we actually live in a society that has set us up to more likely cause harm than to not, if we're going to just go off what we've seen and act according to what we've seen. And so because of that, good people can very well abuse another individual and still be a good person, but that their actions can still cause harm, right? And it's important. So I want you to think, broaden your idea of what a perpetrator can be. That anyone can abuse, any gender, race, socioeconomic status, anyone can cause harm to another individual. When we do so, we not only do we continue to believe survivors, because when they come forward, we're not going to question who caused harm to them. We're going to simply be there for them. But we're also going to become more accountable for our actions as individuals, right? If we think like, oh, I'm a good person, I would never cause harm, we're never going to do the work to understand how we could potentially harm somebody else. But when we realize that anybody can cause harm, we start to take personal responsibility. And we also start to hold our friends and our family members accountable, because we start to realize a lot of us can cause harm and a lot of us can do better. And so we can take that personal responsibility and change our behaviors accordingly. The last thing I want to talk about is abuse, right? Not only do we have this idea of what a survivor should look like, what a perpetrator should look like, but we also have these ideas of what abuse should look like, what sexual misconduct looks like. And again, going from mostly what we've seen on movies and TV shows. So if I was to ask you to tell me what sexual harassment looks like, you would likely tell me something probably in the workplace between coworkers, or like a quid pro quo type thing where a professor is requiring sexual activity from a student in order for that student to get a good grade, or a supervisor over an employee holding like a raise or promotion over them. That's kind of what we think of when we think of sexual harassment. When in reality, the behaviors that fall within sexual harassment are expansive. There's so many ways in which we can sexual harass somebody, right? Even just like, or like behaviors like crude jokes in the workplace, or like making derogatory comments towards somebody's appearance, or elevator eyes when you're looking somebody up and down, right? Cat calls. These are all falling with sexual harassment behaviors that aren't acceptable. The second one is sexual assault. You would likely tell me what we just talked about, right? With this perfect victim narrative, that if someone's sexually assaulted, it's likely violent, it's likely between strangers, somebody who is a bad guy is jumping out of the bushes and attacking an innocent female, when in reality, that's just not the case. Sexual assault is so much broader than that. And it actually, most of the time, happens between people who know each other, right? And it doesn't just involve penetration. There's also fondling behaviors that happen within sexual assault, right? The touching of sexual body part or intimate body parts without the consent of another individual falls within sexual assault, right? The next is relationship violence. We oftentimes think that relationship violence or like domestic violence happens between individuals who are married, and it's usually the husband physically abusing the wife, when in reality, that's just not the case either. Relationship violence can happen between anybody who's dating or married or in a relationship, right? And it can go both ways. It's not just, one individual abusing the other. It can go both ways. It doesn't know gender. It doesn't know socioeconomic status. It's not just physical behaviors. It can also be emotional abuse, financial abuse. So many things encompassed within relationship violence that go beyond what we've been told. And finally, stalking behaviors. This is the final sexual misconduct term, and we look at stalking as somebody following somebody around, seeking to cause harm. And while that does still happen with stalking, a lot of stalking behaviors have gone virtual. They've gone online, right? Where we're consistently messaging or following people who have asked us to no longer follow them. So I encourage you all to go look at the Savvy and Office of Equity website. If you have more questions about what's involved in these abusive behaviors. But just again, when it comes to the survivor, the perpetrator, or the abuse, expanding your understanding of what that could look like. Because when we do that, we're no longer trying to fit somebody into a box, right? It's like that interview with Marie. The detectives were just trying to make sense of her story. But in doing so, they put their own bias onto her story, and they tried to fit what she was telling them within their own understanding of what was going on. And they painted a different narrative than what happened. Again, they weren't being malicious, they weren't ill-intentioned, but they allowed their implicit biases of what survivors look like, what perpetrators look like, and what abuse looks like to impact their ability to believe Marie's story for what it truly was, right? And they tried to make it fit into their narrative. So the more we understand about how broad and complex these are, the more willing we'll be able to believe a survivor when they come forward and not blame them for what happened to them.
So let's talk about the effects of victim blaming. What is the impact of either blaming someone for what happened to them or not believing them at all? The first one is that it removes responsibility from the perpetrator of harm. So the second that we're saying, well, you did this or didn't do this, and that's why it happened, the perpetrator is now off the hook. They did nothing wrong because it's the responsibility of the person who experienced it. And think about how traumatic that is. Not only did someone go through something incredibly difficult, but now people are telling them that it's their fault and they're the reason why it happened. Like, that is such a terrible, like, double impact that can happen. And then when this happens, survivors continue to be less likely to seek support and resources because they believe what happened to them is their fault. They're like, well, I'm like Felicia talked about, that shame and embarrassment, right? Not only are they, now they feel bad about what happened and they feel like it's their fault. Now they're also going to say, I'm not going to seek healing resources and support from other humans because I'm ashamed, because I caused this and I don't want people to think I was wrong or bad. And so this is, again, it just adds to the trauma. And in fact, some survivors say that the not being believed or being blamed for what happened was just as traumatic as the incident itself, added to that trauma. And then it perpetuates a culture that tolerates and justifies violence. And the reason for this is because when we're victim blaming, we're essentially saying there are certain times when it is okay to sexually assault someone or commit violence against them if they are doing certain things. So we're excusing violence when we victim blame. We're saying, well, if she was wearing that, then it's okay. And it's never okay, right? And so that continues. So perpetrators, and like Felicia said, all of us have caused harm and will cause harm at some point, we hear, well, that wasn't my fault, that was their fault and they deserved it. And again, how harmful is that, right? That we have these stories and these narratives, and that causes a lot of harm. And so the effects of victim blaming really go beyond just like the one moment of someone feeling like they aren't believed. It not only impacts the survivor for the rest of their life, it also impacts the perpetrator and future harm they might engage in because they aren't held accountable. And it perpetuates our culture, right? This is a social norm. And so Felicia is now going to talk about how we can be upstanders to help mitigate the effects of victim blaming when it does happen.
Great, thank you, Tanisha. So first, expand your understanding and dismantle the implicit biases you have regarding sexual misconduct and what it looks like, right? We've started doing that in this conversation today. Continue to do that. Continue to try and understand and learn the complexities of sexual violence and relationship violence. Realizing that there's so many biases that are put into us based off our societal norms that are just inaccurate. And that's not, again, that's not you you're not a bad person because you believe a survivor should look a certain way, or you believe that violence should look a certain way. You've been programmed to think that way. But it is now your responsibility to recognize, I have been programmed to view this a certain way and to respond a certain way. And is that the correct response? Is that the correct perspective? And if it's not, do the work to dismantle those beliefs, right? And that starts when that comes into play when someone comes and discloses to you. Start by believing, right? Rather than questioning or judging them. When someone first discloses an experience, start by believing. Even if you are an investigator who has to ultimately determine whether a law was broken or a policy violation occurred, you've got to start by believing. You've got to start by believing that that person who came to you and is reporting something is telling you the truth, that their experience really happened. And then you can move forward with the investigation and gather evidence neutrally, right? And ultimately determine whether a policy violation occurred or the law was broken. But we've got to start with that belief, right? We've got to start by thinking they're telling the truth. And when we respond to them, focus on validation and empathy. Again, we talked about the experience a survivor has and why they won't come forward, how scary, what's going on in their mind is they're all over the place. They're judging themselves. They're ashamed of what happened. And then they get the courage, the immense courage to come forward and tell you, whether you're a friend and family member or an investigator or therapist, whatever role you play, they get the immense courage to come and tell you something so personal. And if the first thing we do is question them, they're likely not going to tell anybody their story again, right? Even if you have questions, because we talked about this, it's a defense mechanism. It's what we're going to naturally do. We want to ask questions. We want to understand what happened, but can potentially be so detrimental to the person disclosing to you. So in that moment, it's about them, right? It's about them feeling validated. I'm so happy you came to me and told me this. I can't imagine what you're going through. How can I help? The only question we should ask a survivor when they first come forward is, how can I help, right? Rather than judging their experience. And I know not all of you will deal with survivors or have a survivor come to you and disclose an experience, but there is stuff you can do every single day to shift our culture from one of victim blaming to belief, right? Call out victim blaming and the culture that supports it, especially when it's hard. When you hear those remarks of, well, she was kind of asking for it, or he can't be abused by his girlfriend, he's a guy, like, man up. When you hear these types of comments, call them out. Actively say, like, that's not okay. Whether you do it in the moment or you send an email later or a text message, have a conversation or a text message exchange later that says, hey, this comment you made earlier, I don't agree with it, right? We have to start calling out victim blaming culture. Shoot, you can even call it out in the movies and TV shows you're watching and say, excuse me, that is not the right way to navigate that conversation, right? But we got to stop victim blaming. Victim blaming does not do anybody a service, whether it's the individual who experienced the violence, even the perpetrator, and our society at large. Victim blaming keeps survivors silent. It keeps these conversations swept under the rug because we don't want to acknowledge the reality. And so we have to start slowly shifting that conversation in all that we do. So we want to quickly end with scenarios where I know that this has been going on we've been talking for a minute, but we do want you to have the opportunity to think about what we've been talking about and how you can apply that in your day-to-day life. So we'll read through the scenarios for you all and answer a little bit about how we would navigate each situation. But take your time, pause the training if you need to think through this, or have conversations if you're watching it with somebody else, to really think about how can I respond in these situations, because these aren't unlikely situations. The scenarios we have for you today are actually very common. So our first one, you've been working in a new office for about 2 months now. Your coworker Alex has started to make comments to you that sexualize your appearance. You confide in another coworker and they tell you, that's just Alex, don't make a big deal about it. Alex has been working here for almost 2 decades and is well known throughout the community. So go ahead and pause for a minute and think about what are signs that this behavior isn't okay, could be a problem. How would you intervene? And what are some of the potential costs and benefits of your intervention? Okay, so we're going to go ahead and dive into how we would approach this scenario. So first and foremost, some of the signs that this could be a problem. And Tanisha, you jump in if you feel like I'm missing anything. But the signs that this is a problem, first of all, is that these sexualized comments are being made. These are not appropriate for a workplace. And so that's problem number 1. Problem number 2 is when when you went to your coworker and your coworker kind of dismissed your concerns, right? That was not a start by believing response. That was not a trauma-informed response. That was one of like kind of shaming a little bit, like don't make a big deal about this. It's like, it's nothing. It's just who they are. You're making this too big of a deal, right? And so how would I intervene in this scenario? Now, for me, if I'm the individual who has had this experience and is going forward, I went forward to my coworker, maybe I would think of a different coworker or a supervisor that I could confide in that might take this more seriously, like might take my concerns more seriously, right? But again, noting that I'm likely very defeated after being shut down once. And so looking at potential, reporting options that I could do online, that would be an easier way to share my concerns. Also, just going to coworkers and who I know will believe me and asking if they'll stand up for me, right? And I would encourage you all, if you are that coworker, if you are that person on the outside who has witnessed this happening, don't wait for somebody to come to you and say, can you help me, right? If you recognize that your coworker is struggling and you can help advocate for them. You could, even if that's just validating their experience, like that wasn't okay, then be an upstander, right? And do what you can to help that coworker in that scenario. Anything you would add, Tanisha?
I think that something, and this is kind of one of my go-to upstander strategies is, I know this is a situation where you're the one experiencing it, but if you aren't, or you feel comfortable doing this, like quick little quips or questions are so powerful. Even if someone's not responding in the moment, they usually think about it. So saying to the coworker, well, maybe someone should make it a big deal, right? Or saying to the coworker, asking them, why do you think that it shouldn't be a big deal, right? Or has anyone else had this issue? So kind of like less confrontational questions, because I know a lot of people are like, well, I don't want to just say that's not okay, which you absolutely can do if you're a very direct person, but especially being a new employee, that can be scary. Or if you're like me, less confrontational. So that's just something I would add.
Great. So think about what you would do, and we'll move to the next scenario.
Did we skip to? Okay, this is scenario 2. You and your coworker are helping a student or colleague, Jasmine, who needs support because she's been struggling. She tells you she's been trying to make sense of what happened at a party a few weeks ago where she woke up half dressed next to a guy she didn't know. Jasmine says she's confused and doesn't know how to feel. Your coworker responds, "It sounds like you partied too hard and just don't remember meeting him." So go ahead, and if you would like to pause this video for a moment to think about the questions of what might be happening that's not okay, how could you intervene, and then what the potential costs and benefits might be. But let's go ahead and discuss it now. So I think biggest sign that someone might, that there's a scenario, something's going on, right, is Jasmine's struggling. She doesn't feel okay, and something happened that was potentially non-consensual, and she doesn't know how she feels about it. And like Felicia talked about, that's like really common, where someone experiences like a sexual assault, sexual misconduct, and it takes them a while to process it because of trauma, because of all of our narratives about those experiences. So that's a big sign. And then the other thing is the coworker saying, "Oh, well, you partied too hard and don't remember." So kind of dismissing Jasmine, feeling concerned about it and unsure, and being like, "Oh, it's not a big deal." And also that you partied too hard, right? So like alcohol, if you don't remember something, but you were just because you were too drunk, then it must have been fine, right? Which is not true. So those are the big signs of a problem for me. And if I were to intervene in this scenario, right, like I'm a third party in this scenario, depending on the situation, an option could be talking to Jasmine alone after and saying, "Hey, my coworker said that and I disagree. Like, I don't think that was okay, and I'm here for you. How can I support you?" Right? Or you could call the coworker out in the moment, right? And saying, "You know what, even if she did party hard, that doesn't mean that it was okay, right? Or that doesn't mean that it wasn't something that she wanted." And then also saying to the coworker in private, maybe that's how you approach it too, of saying, "I know you said that earlier, and it really was something I wasn't okay with." Felicia, what would you do in this situation, or something you want to add?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said. I tend to be more direct, so I would probably respectfully challenge, if that's the word I use, my coworker in the moment, saying, in what ways was her partying too hard justifying what she experienced, right? And having a dialogue right then. But I recognize that that's not safe for everybody to do. And so another option outside of what Tanisha mentioned, which I think are all great options, is reporting to somebody else, a supervisor, another colleague who might be willing to confront the situation. Anybody, if a coworker, a friend of the coworker who made that comment, or a friend of Jasmine's, like there, you can always involve a third party who you think might be better at delivering a message than you in the particular situation. Okay, our final scenario today. One of your coworkers, Carlos, has been late for work lately and has frequently had to step away from meetings to answer the phone. Each time he says, "Sorry, I have to take this, it's my husband." When he comes back, Carlos is usually upset, and sometimes you hear him talking angrily to his husband. One day when Carlos steps away for another call, your supervisor says, "I'm worried about him and his work. His life would be so much easier if he left his husband instead of putting up with that crap." So pause for a second if you need to and think about how you would approach the situation. I'm going to jump right into how I would respond to this and why this is a problem. So the first sign that this is a problem is Carlos's interactions with his husband, right? That he not only is he having to consistently answer phone calls that seem to be pretty heated phone calls. That's sign number one that there's a concern, but there's also added to that is that he's been late for work. He's frequently stepping away from things. He's not performing in the way that he once was, which is an indicator to me that something in his life is impacting him greatly. And then because of the consistent phone calls and relationship that I am observing between him and his husband, I can likely equate that something is going on there that's causing distress, that's causing this for Carlos to struggle, right? And so that's problem number one. Problem number two is the supervisor comment, right? Again, this idea that it's the victim's responsibility to leave an unhealthy relationship, that they need to take responsibility for not being harmed anymore, right? We see this a lot when it comes to unhealthy relationships. Well, why didn't you just leave sooner? Why don't you just speak up to your partner? And the reality is, like, again, I mean, just think about how it doesn't make sense to say it's the victim's responsibility, the person who's being harmed in the relationship, it's their responsibility to stop the harm. It doesn't make sense, right? It's the responsibility of the person who's causing the harm. And so there is that victim blaming nature within the comment made by the supervisor of just, if he would just leave his partner, it would be so much easier. It is not Carlos's responsibility to be in a relationship that doesn't harm him, right? It's his partner's responsibility to stop causing harm. And the reality is, Carlos loves his partner. He cares about them, right? It's not so easy to step away from a relationship that isn't healthy for you. It's incredibly complicated. Statistically, someone will try to leave a relationship that's unhealthy 7 times before doing so successfully. That means they leave it and come back to it 7 times. Not just that they say they're going to leave it, but they actually leave it and come back to that relationship 7 times before they choose to leave that relationship permanently. So with that being said, how would I approach this scenario? Again, I tend to be a very forward person, but I'm not even gonna lie, even myself would be intimidated addressing my supervisor in this situation, right? I probably would be nervous to dive into everything I just dived into with you all about the dynamics of domestic violence or relationship violence in this moment. But I would probably ask my supervisor or say something along the lines of like, support towards Carlos, right? Like, I can't imagine what he's going through. Just you being able to make a comment that is opposite of victim blaming, right? That is providing that empathy for that victim, even if you're not directly calling out that supervisor's comment and saying like, you shouldn't say that, for you to say something different of like, I can't imagine what Carlos is going through. It's going to stop that narrative, that victim blaming narrative, rather than if you fed into it and was like, yeah, I don't know why he's staying. This has been going on forever. Like, it's so crazy to me. Like, it might be seem easier to feed into it because we all fall victim to group norms, group think, and wanting to go along with everybody. But the power of saying, I can't imagine what he's going through, right? It ends that victim mentality narrative. It shows that like this culture is not acceptable. Comments like that are not acceptable without actually having to say like, that's not acceptable comment. And then I would also be sure to check in with Carlos, right? To validate for him that I don't understand what he's going through, but I can't imagine what he's going through. And I can only kind of understand how complicated it must be to be in the relationship and going through what he's going through. And again, how can I support you? Is there anything I can do to support you? Tanisha, anything you would add?
I think this kind of goes along with what you've already said, Felicia, but what really stands out to me is the supervisor does express that they're worried about him. And so you know that this is coming from a place of caring. And so to tap into that and say, I'm really worried about him too. How do you think we can help him?
Yeah.
Right. So it's like a different kind of reframe, similar to what Felicia was saying. Or I'm worried about him too. I wish his husband would treat him better. So again, like reframing it, but like validating. But yeah, I agree. Like, especially when it's your supervisor, that's super scary to stand up, even though it's important.
Yes. Okay, so those are our scenarios for you today. Here is our contact information. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions or would like to provide this training to a group of people that you know would appreciate it. I know this is a recording, but we're also happy to come in person and give this training at any time. So thank you all so much for being in this space with us. And hopefully you can carry this conversation past this training. So thank you.